1987 initiated a new era for James Bond. Since Roger Moore's swan song, A View to a Kill, was criticized by fans, critics, and its own filmmakers, producer Albert Broccoli decided to alter the tone of the subsequent films. This relied on concurrently altering the presentation of its lead character. Up to this point, Bond had been presented as charming but generally detached. His only goal was to complete his mission, and he didn't really care about anything or anyone else but that. He seduced women for his own gratification and was usually depicted as not caring when an ally or a lover was killed. Being a pattern that had somewhat grown stale over the course of 14 films, Bond had to be adapted into what my friends so eloquently called a Bond for the new generation, or what I like to call the modern Bond, who would be depicted in the next 3 films. In fact, Broccoli considered making the first of these films, The Living Daylights, a prequel, or possibly a reboot. Fans of the Ian Fleming source material would understand that 2 parts of James Bond's persona are presented. There was the cold, slightly sociopathic, but charming external character, and there was the inner monologue of Bond, that showed that Bond actually does give a damn when a lover or an ally was killed, and he does have anxiety in regards to the success of his mission. These elements culminate into what is the modern Bond. The Living Daylights introduced us to this new era of Bond, with a neat opening sequence which has M having 002, 004, and 007 participate in a training exercise in Gibraltar. The scene teases its audience by keeping them guessing which one of these men is Bond. Let's see, this guy could be Bond. He kinda looks like Roger Moore. Oh wait, never mind. Bond wouldn't get caught so easily. Maybe it's this guy. He looks a bit like George Lazenby. Never mind. As you can see, this exercise is interrupted when an unwelcome assassin rudely cuts 004's rope, leading up to a dramatic reveal of 007 played by Timothy Dalton. By the way, I always thought it was amusing that the filmmakers chose to kill the Lazenby lookalike. Anyway, we're treated to a neat chase scene, which features Dalton performing his own stunt atop the Jeep, at the end of which we get a couple of Bond staples.
Who are you?
Bond, James Bond. Exercise Control 007 here. I'll report in an hour.
Won't you join me?
Better make that 2.
This film, being a bit of a transition film between the early Bond and the modern Bond, we get the final appearances of a few familiar faces, including General Gogol and Defense Minister Frederick Gray, whom we had seen in every Bond film since The Spy Who Loved Me. This is also the last time John Barry scored a Bond film, and I think, despite some use of some 80s synthesizers, is actually one of his more memorable scores. Lastly, it's the penultimate Bond film for both Robert Brown's M and writer Richard Maibaum. The plot really kicks off with the scene after the credits, which is a close adaptation of the Living Daylights short story. This is where we really see the other side of Bond. Here, Bond refuses to kill a sniper intending to prevent the defection of Russian General Koskov when he learns she was a cellist that he was admiring. This scene is filled with conflict as Bond worries about the success of his mission and argues with Agent Saunders. Through a series of twists and turns, we learn that Koskov's defection was actually a ploy so that he could embezzle Russian funds, and the sniper was actually his girlfriend, Kara Malovi, who he wanted killed because she knew too much. As you can see here, she has a number of traits that make her a decent enough Bond girl. All kidding aside, she does well in her scenes with Dalton. In fact, I think these two have the most convincing relationship of any Bond with Bond girl pair. And yes, I include Bond's relationship with Tracy and Vesper. It's just that this is one of the few times we see Bond gradually develop a realistic relationship with a Bond girl. Bond starts out as a casual admirer, and later becomes an annoyed escort.
Why didn't you learn the violin.
Likewise, Kara has trouble deciding whether or not Bond can be trusted. Over time, the two warm up to each other as they successfully escape the Russian authorities. This is a scene where we see the return of Bond's gadget-laden Aston Martin. The chase is one of the better ones of the series as Bond eludes roadblocks, police cars, and tanks. The car has much of the usual stuff, lasers, rockets, and so forth, but also has some stuff we haven't seen, including outriggers, spiked tires, and jet propulsion. The scene also includes Bond intelligently making use of a damaged wheel to cut a hole in the ice to trap clueless pursuers. Having escaped on Kara's cello case, Bond and Kara travel through Europe, where we see Bond give her opportunities that she wouldn't have otherwise had, and so her affection for him grows. And Kara's responses to Bond's actions reflect the life she lived under the communists. She's unable to fulfill her dream of performing music in highly respected places. She lives in relative poverty, and has almost always had to rely on her boyfriend, General Koskov, who helps put her through the emotional wringer that she goes through in this film. Her boyfriend tries to have her killed. She gets arrested by the KGB. She has to choose between her boyfriend and Bond. She gets caught up in the exploits of the mission, and so on and so forth. Now, while some reviews have called her character a ditzy blonde, and in some scenes this is apparent,
What kind of horse?
You're calling me a horse's ass.
You were fantastic. We're free.
Kara, we're inside a Russian airbase in the middle of Afghanistan.
it's all a reflection of how she's a normal person in an extreme environment, not an agent, and not a complete idiot like Mary Goodnight. Another good thing about this film is that Kara is not the only well-developed character, as Bond's allies get the same treatment. In the opening sniper scene, we are introduced to Agent Saunders, who comes off as a bit of something that Jack Wade from GoldenEye described.
For crying out loud, another stiff-ass Brit.
His stuck-up nature almost cost them the mission when he thinks that he can easily sneak Koskov across the border in the trunk of his car. I like the bit where Bond one-ups him by reusing a phrase that he tried to use to make himself seem more professional.
What's your escape route?
Sorry, old man. Section 26, paragraph 5. That information is on a need-to-know basis only. I'm sure you understand.
Dad.
Where are you taking him? How will you get him out?
Sorry, old man. Section 26, paragraph 5. Need to know. Sure you understand.
He doesn't take it well.
I have no intention of leaving it at that, 007. I'm reporting to M that you deliberately missed. Your orders were to kill that sniper.
Stuff my orders.
Later, when Bond convinces him his actions were more than what they seemed, he acquiesces and decides to help Bond at the risk of losing his own job, making it all the more saddening that he is brutally killed by Necros. Another well-developed character is General Pushkin, who is framed for the murders of British agents including 004 and Saunders. The framing results in the best scene of this film and possibly the best in either of the Dalton films. Bond's interrogation of Pushkin. We see the conflict between these two men as Bond considers killing a political rival that he's actually fond of. The conflict escalates when Pushkin calls his guard to attack Bond. Bond cleverly uses the image of a nude woman to distract the guard and goes back to interrogating Pushkin, with whom he develops a plan to fake his death, which in turn leads to a great action scene on the rooftops of Tangiers, which is said to have inspired a similar scene in The Bourne Ultimatum. Lastly, we're introduced to the Mujahideen fighter Kamran Shah, who despite being saved by Bond, refuses to help him for fear of the Russians. It is not until Kara almost embarrasses him in front of his men that he decides to help.
James is trapped. You must help him.
He'll have to take his chances.
You can't leave him. You owe him your life.
There's nothing more I can do.
Yes, there is.
Women.
Shah reappears at the end of the film, where we are given a little epilogue for Kara, something atypical for a Bond girl. We learn that she was successful in achieving her dream of performing in well-respected concert halls. Despite having a good supporting cast, I always found the villains of this film to be rather weak. Part of the problem stems from the fact that there are two main villains, General Koskov and an arms dealer named Brad Whitaker, who's played by an actor who would return in GoldenEye.
Another stiff-ass Brit.
Of these two, the one we get to know is Koskov. Bond has many interactions with him, which start out with them as allies, but later as enemies. We're presented with different scenes where they outsmart each other, so one would think this would naturally lead to a final fight between them. But Koskov isn't the man in charge, Whitaker is. So it is him who Bond has the final fight against, which, while cleverly executed, doesn't have the same punch the scene would have had if the fight had been against Koskov. The film probably would have been better if the plot was reworked so the two were combined into one character, or maybe have Koskov kill Whitaker at some point, which would make Koskov more memorable and more menacing. But alas, we're still left with a decent ending, including a scene where Koskov tries to lie his way out of the situation, only to be arrested by Pushkin. We are given a decent henchman in the film with the new blonde tough guy, Necros, who might be the only henchman in the series with a theme song. His effectiveness is illustrated in his killing of Saunders and the agents in the kidnapping scene. During this scene, he disguises himself as a milkman and a doctor, while being adept at disguising his voice. He also gets into an intense fight with an unnamed MI6 agent. I think, however, if this fight had been against Bond, it would have gone a long way to making the villains of the film more memorable. At least Bond gives Necros a pretty good send-off. And we know he dies because he's not Jaws. A final word on this film. Given the film was overlooked upon its release, I think this may be the most underrated film in the series. It has the trappings of all the best Bond films of the series, while including very well-developed characters, an engaging but complex plot, lots of innovative action scenes, and a rarely seen intensity brought on by a new Bond actor. Given the in-depth detail I've given about the characters in this film, I'll give my opinion of Timothy Dalton's Bond at a later date. Until then, I highly recommend this film, and I think it's a great start to the modern Bond era.
Stiff-ass Brit.